Our speaker tonight, Dr. Daniel Green, is a defense fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he focuses on counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency, and stability operations in the Middle East and Central Asia. He's also a reserve officer with the U.S. Navy. Rather than repeating the introduction to Dr. Green that you've all received, I would like to just read you a paragraph from the foreword in this book. We'll give you some knowledge of him. This book, by the way, which is for sale outside at our special Westminster price, is, as you will see on the jacket, highly endorsed by General John Allen, General David Petraeus, Peter Bergen, and others. And also, we're very happy to have the publisher from the Naval Institute Press, Claire Noble, with us tonight. And her husband, Jeff, is here too. So let me read you just this paragraph from the foreword, written by a Green Beret colleague of our speaker tonight. Speaking of Dan Green, he says he was in the Pentagon on 9/11 and saw the war on terror at its very inception. But unlike most in Washington, he was determined to get on the ground and do something about it. He went on to serve in Uruzgan province, Afghanistan, with a provincial reconstruction team as a State Department civilian in a policy advisory role in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as a naval officer in the coalition headquarters in Kabul, in Iraq during the Anbar Awakening, and back to Uruzgan as a tribal advisor with Navy SEALs and U.S. Army Green Berets. For his extraordinary service, Dr. Green's received the State Department Superior Honor Award and the U.S. Army Superior Civilian Honor Award for his work in Afghanistan. He was also personally commended by General Peter Pace when he was chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's also, this is your third book.
Yes, I look forward to meeting this person too.
Number 3. What I'm going to suggest to you is you watch the video and see if you can recognize him. So the first book, reflecting on his first year of experiences in Afghanistan, is called The Valley's Edge, a year with the Pashtuns in the heartland of the Taliban. Then co-authoring with Brigadier General William Mullen, Fallujah Redux, the Anbar Awakening, and the struggle with Al-Qaeda. Most recently, he contributed a chapter to a book with the less than sanguine title, Our Latest, Longest War, Losing Hearts and Minds in Afghanistan. He's here to talk to us tonight about his new book, In the Warlords' Shadow, Special Operations Forces, the Afghans, and their fight against the Taliban. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Green.
Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate the introduction. Hope I live up to it. I wrote the book for a variety of reasons. I know many of you here have served in Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times, or in similar parts around the world. And the benefit of having 5 tours altogether in Iraq and Afghanistan, starting in 05, 06, and recently finishing in 15 and 16 in Baghdad, Iraq, doing another mobilization, is you start to get a little bit of wisdom about these conflicts and how our government wages these wars. And of course, war is a very personal thing. We all have our individual experiences, but I've tried to, at least through my own personal experience, aggregate what I've seen at the ground level, working in OSD policy, working at the State Department. I didn't mention this, but I was a Bush-Cheney political appointee as well for 8 years, so I have kind of a political background, an academic background, a naval background, State Department background. My resume looks like I can't keep a job, but I can assure you it somehow meshes together in a useful, interesting way, and hopefully you'll agree with that assessment. Since you've shared a little bit about my background, this particular book that I wrote is sort of a reaction to a lot of how memoirs are typically written about wars, especially irregular wars or small wars. Most memoirs are first-person accounts written by junior officers from combat arms, whether they're Navy SEALs, they're Green Berets, or infantry, they're Marines. It's typically a book about their first tour. It's typically about shaping and clearing operations, as we would call it, the counterinsurgency language. Typically, if locals are mentioned in these books, they're usually shooting at you. And if they aren't shooting at you, they're typically hard luck cases, a medical emergency of someone, a beloved interpreter, someone of that nature. And then you don't really have a sense of the local history of where the soldier, sailor, airman, marine is serving. You don't have much of a historical perspective on that area. So you don't have much of a context other than what you see through, your rifle scope. And then typically memoirs sort of disappear after the 03, 04 level, and they reemerge at the general officer level, typically as the general retires. And there are a smattering of memoirs in the middle, usually by staff officers who've been wronged in some way, and they feel the need. We don't know anyone like that, I'm sure, but those are rather riveting, I would say. But so, if you're an American who supports your country and wants your country to do well and win these conflicts, you don't have any direct exposure or experience to the military or anything, to do with these conflicts, you're sort of hard pressed. You get a lot of these really riveting first-person shooter kind of memoirs, but you don't really have a long-term view on the war. You have journalists that will come in and write up perspectives on the conflict, and even movies, for example. Movies about irregular wars typically are much more political, they're much more charged, or they're sort of focusing on a narrow mission that didn't go well, like Lone Survivor, or Chris Kyle's book about American Sniper. So you don't really have, it's hard to sort of capture irregular wars in popular culture. So the book I wrote here is an attempt to sort of address some of these shortcomings. I was fortunate enough to serve in a province called Uruzgan twice, almost 2 years altogether, and my tours were separated by 7 years. So I got to see the province initially in 2005, 2006 with the State Department, and then I went back 7 years later with the military. My first tour there in the province was with the State Department. I was a political officer in the province, and I was an advisor to a provincial reconstruction team, which I know many of you know about what that is, but pretty much it's a civil military team focused on good governance, reconstruction, and development, and works very closely with the local governor and provincial council and tribal leaders of a province. And then I got a chance to go back 7 years later with the Navy as a mobilized reservist, and I was attached to one of our SEAL team elements, and I was their tribal political advisor for these, for the province and for the tribes, and kind of navigating these relationships. But a lot of my experience is sort of you learn things as you go on each of these tours. So 05, 06, being the political advisor, my role was to just understand pretty much everything and anything that went on in the province that could impact local politics. But we didn't really have much of a blueprint for this. There was no off-the-shelf book on all the local tribes and leaders in history. It was pretty much a blank slate. So I thought that was great because I'm a social scientist, so I was unleashed on this unsuspecting population and got to interview all these wonderful Afghan tribal leaders, figure out the names of the tribes, the settlements, what did you do during the Mujahideen, what did you do during the Taliban, really recreate, figure out this wonderful maze, And I know individuals who are doing this all over Afghanistan. So there I got a sensitivity to how important tribes are, local governance, these kind of micro histories. Then I served in Iraq in 07 with the Navy. I was attached to another SEAL team, and I was their tribal kind of outreach officer for the Fallujah area just before the Anbar Awakening showed up in Fallujah. So through that job, I got to see how we worked with tribes and operationalized relationships to provide security, how you could actually have success in counterinsurgency when you saw the city flip from 780 security incidents in March of 07 to less than 80 in October of 07. What came together for that to occur? Then I went back to Afghanistan in 09, 2010 at a 3-star command, which is not fun at all generally, especially if you're a junior officer. Colonels aren't even treated well there, so I got to see things kind of at the macro level. And then I got to go back to Uruzgan in 2012, and then I just recently went back to Iraq in 15, 16, reinventing the wheel, yet again. I was a tribal outreach officer there, reconnecting with some tribal leaders we'd worked with in Anbar, and then realizing again, we have constant rotations and people don't remember the lessons we've learned. So this book in particular, it's about one province, but it's really about special operations forces over the history of the conflict. It's as much a history or an intellectual history of special operations from 9/11 to about 2016, as much as it is a memoir. And it's really trying to trace the intellectual development of a series of concepts that have a lot of catchphrases now, like persistent presence, by, with, and through, a bottom-up approach, these kinds of things that are very much known in the counterinsurgency world. But in 2010, Special Operations Community came up with a program called Village Stability Operations. It was this bottom-up approach of providing enduring local security that reimagined how SOF was going to be used. So instead of helicoptering in or doing a direct action raid on a village and leaving, it said we're going to have persistent presence. Instead of security being something that was done to the local population, it was something that was done with the local population. Instead of seeing it as purely a kinetic approach, it actually said kinetic was only in the service of local governance, tribal empowerment, and enlisting locals in their own defense. It was a holistic approach, so it also addressed simultaneously the governing component, the psychological component, the development component, as much as the security component. And it was a dispersed strategy. In a lot of ways, it was sort of using the Taliban strategy and structure against it. And so doing was very effective, very fundamentally sort of changed the conflict where it was applied. Now, of course, the thing about these kinds of programs is they're very much contrary to how our bureaucracies are organized and designed and how we incentivize careers. And typically, I think as Americans, we usually get the war right just before we leave. And usually when we start these kind of irregular wars, we're the most confident in our abilities, but the least wise. And usually by the end of it, we're very wise, but we're the least confident. And so this is a very late program, 2010, 9 years into the war. This program was finally kind of came together. And I traced the evolution of thinking over time. So essentially the Village Stability Operations Program said, look, we can clear villages and valleys with our own forces in perpetuity, the only limit being U.S. appetite to accept casualties, right? And frankly, the wear and tear on our forces. And they said, there's got to be a better way. And a group of mostly Green Berets, and many who contributed to it, but I think the core were these Green Beret soldiers, officers who had been in the conflict for multiple rotations. They had cleared the same villages and valleys. They had seen the Anbar Awakening, where tribes had risen up against al-Qaeda in Western Iraq, which sensitized people to tribes. And they said, there's got to be a better way of doing this. There's a limit to kill capture missions. They're absolutely essential, but there's a limit. And so they said, how can we do this? And so we kind of got to a point where we're not only wiser about the way of waging these kinds of wars, but also smarter about Afghan culture. We realized that stability can't happen in Afghanistan, but it has to be in the Afghan cultural context. It's got to be reflective of the Afghan culture. And so this institutional adaptation to Afghanistan came about in 2010. And essentially it was the numbers varied, but about 120 or 130 dispersed sites across the country in rural districts of Afghanistan where Green Beret and SEAL elements would live in a village for their whole tour. They wouldn't just visit the village, they'd live there for the whole period of time. And they would analyze the tribal and local dynamics, trying to figure out what friction there exists between villages or tribes or leaders. Was there a water dispute? Was there a dispute about access to a road? These kinds of things that often drove local conflicts that the Taliban would take advantage of. Once they'd done these assessments, they'd start to have outreach meetings with local elders. And so they would convene these local shuras. And through these engagements, you start to empower elders to have some control over their own destiny. And from these engagements, you say, look, we've got this great program called Village Stability Operations, or Afghan Local Police. You volunteer your young men from your village. We will vet them, we will train them in your village, and they'll get a small salary from the Afghan government. They'll get a uniform, AK-47, some rounds, and construction materials to build checkpoints. And they'll live in your village, you'll be protecting your people, your families, and that's all we ask of you. And essentially you'll be supported by the Afghan National Police in the area. They'll control your pay, your logistics, your supply, and that's kind of the deal. And the Afghan army will work with you. And these villagers loved it. So you're empowering elders, you're providing them a paycheck through the Afghan government, you're giving them the confidence of being sort of organizing themselves to resist the Taliban. And it's a great way of essentially robbing the Taliban of manpower. So every local villager who joins with you is one less potential Taliban recruit. And with each community, once you recruit enough local villagers, you kind of get this tipping point where the village now is able to protect itself. And it's amazing when you see it actually happen. So I talk in the book about a district called Shahidi Assas that I visited in 05-06. The district had a forward operating base there called Cobra. The commander of that often called himself Cobra Commander after G.I. Joe. And essentially the base itself was surrounded by the Taliban insurgency by 06. The Taliban had largely mined every road going out from the base, and there was no way you could really pacify the district. And pretty much the special forces team that was there was just there to survive their tour. And in 06, they had a team there that lost, I think, 7 people and had 22 casualties for a team that's 40 people. So it was a really bad situation. And you could only fly there. You couldn't really drive to that district. It was just surrounded. 7 years later, I got to go back to that district in that particular FOB, and we drove there. And in the intervening period, this program called Village Stability Operations had been applied to the district. So from one base, we now had 4 bases. From no local recruits, we had recruited 500 or so, 600 Afghan local police from that district. So instead of going out at night, hitting compounds, coming home, we would have shuras during the day, and each of these checkpoints we would set up with the locals, protected roads, bridges, bazaar shop entrances, things of this nature. And it largely, it's never defeated the insurgency, but it was no longer a mortal threat where the Taliban could potentially overrun your base. It forced the Taliban to focus on individual level attacks, because that's all that they could muster. They could do suicide attacks, they could do assassinations, they could do propaganda to use the media against you and people's opinions. But we were driving all over this district. I couldn't believe it. There were parts of the district I thought I would never see in my life, and we would just drive around it with no problems. And there was just this lattice work of checkpoints all throughout the area. And I talk about a shura we had with the elders there. And the elders were talking about that earlier time. We were constantly hitting villages and how this created such mistrust between the people and the government. And we were associated with the government because of that. And how because of this program, because we recognized the elders and we trusted them and empowered them, it completely pacified the area. And so this is an approach that essentially is very, very effective. We did it in Anbar province, so in Fallujah. When I was there, we helped pacify the city. We recruited local police from every single district in the city, and we had tribal leaders, volunteer young tribal members throughout the rural areas, supporting them the same way we supported the Afghan local police. And that completely flipped the security. But the problem with this approach is it's not particularly compelling from a movie standpoint. You're not going to have, you have American Sniper, which everyone's like, that's really awesome, but you're not going to have American Engager, as a movie, right? The highest number of key leader engagements, it's like, it's not particularly compelling, and it's a much more humble approach. It's very much bottom up. It's less about what we're doing to the Afghans than what we can help them do for themselves. And it's devastatingly effective. That's partly why I wrote this book, because this program it still exists. I'm not sure of its status, but it's sort of this brief moment in time where we had wisdom and the right leaders come together to come up with this program. Bing West, who you may know, wrote a book called The Village. Many of the concepts are similar from that book as well. Combined action platoons of Marines, embedding in villages, raising local popular forces. But this kind of approach is hard, right? It's hard to brief, it's hard to convey sometimes. You say, well, we've recruited this number of people, that's an easy metric to measure. But usually, again, we get this right just before we leave. And this approach, while it worked very much in Afghanistan, across the war, not just in Afghanistan now, we're kind of reverting back to this direct action culture, dropping ordnance on the enemy. Which again, I'm not against that, but you have to do in balance. It's got to be what's the end state of that. So essentially the book is a memoir, and I visit, we had 17 sites in my tour there. We had 3 provinces. I visit 15 of them, and I kind of show you how some sites are really knocking it out of the park and others are struggling with it. I talk about why this might be the case, and I kind of came up with a statistical analysis at the end where this is where the boring part is. I got a regression analysis and did a statistical analysis of these sites to try to figure out why some were successful and others struggled, with hopefully improving how we did this. And so it's kind of written from a first-person account, because I think people tend to remember things better from first-person accounts than dry sort of academic studies. And then the sort of final chapter, I talk about why are irregular wars kind of so difficult for us as a country. And I kind of focus on 5 major contributing factors. The first is simply we're organized to fight big nation-state wars, do big nation-state diplomacy, big nation-state development, intelligence gathering, and all that kind of stuff. That's great, and we need that. But these problem sets have elements of that, but they're fundamentally different than those sort of factors. A second contributing factor is civil-military relationships. If you look at, like, this is not a lot of people know this, but the National Defense Reorganization Act of 1958. I know all of you are acquainted with it, but let me refresh you here. So that act essentially took the chiefs of staffs out of the chain of command. And President Eisenhower was an advocate for it. It was seen as an act that solidified civil military control. But what it did is it robbed this, I think, connective tissue between the fielded forces and those in Washington. So you don't have a feedback and leadership loop that you used to have in World War II. I'm a big fan of Mark Perry, and I really enjoyed his book, Partners in Command, about George C. Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower. And you see through their correspondence how each one kept the other informed, how Eisenhower would suggest that a general officer be removed from command, and Marshall would help with that. Marshall became aware of what's on the ground through Ike. Ike became aware of D.C. deliberations, and you had the institution of the Army kind of leading this conflict. I think that has been a significant weakening of our ability to conceive of these plans better, to implement them more faithfully, and to adjust when we have to. Because what happens, I think, is you essentially make the Secretary of Defense politically vested in a strategy, whereas if he had a Joint Chiefs of Staff that was a mediating layer, that would allow him to sort of change course through accepting the counsel of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now they're simply focused on train and equip versus running these wars. That's one factor I'd point to. Another aspect of that is the professionalization of our military. It has been very good for us. Obviously, we don't have to plus up in an emergency like we used to for World War I and World War II and other conflicts. But I think there is a negative aspect of professionalism that we don't often think about or talk about. The constant need of career rotations has caused us to have a lot of generalists when these kind of wars need experts and people who have specialized knowledge. There's a careerism mentality that inhibits our ability to adapt to these conflicts. I would also say that the carving out of the Special Forces community from the Army made the Army a little bit more conventional in its thinking and less able to adapt to these conflicts. Another aspect of this is complex narratives of victory. You can say in the Gulf War that victory was kicking Iraq out of Kuwait. How do you convey that similar message for Iraq or Afghanistan? It's much more complex. Another factor is, again, how we remember these wars. We tend to misremember them in literature and popular movies, so that future generations kind of focus on clearing and shaping operations versus holding, building, and transition. It's hard to write a compelling book about meetings with tribal elders. I think they're interesting, but it doesn't engage the senses of like the regular person in the military, right? And then I think the last part of this is simply our political system. It's very much focused on short-term things. We fight these long wars with short-term strategies. And there's no irregular warfare constituency in Congress. There's very much one for potential big wars, jobs tied to contracts, things of this nature, but any sort of other aspects of it have very shallow roots. And that's true as well in the bureaucracy. So aspects of the bureaucracy that fight these wars well, they tend to be the marginal offices that everyone counsels you when you join the agency or wherever you're going, the government. That's a career dead ender, but those are the offices you need for regular war. So for example, within USAID, you have the Office of Transition Initiatives, OTI. Those people have been worth their weight in gold in these conflicts. Within the US military, civil affairs officers are worth their weight in gold, but the movies are always about Green Berets and SEALs. So these are aspects of it. So for example, the human terrain system that was created to sort of understand these problems, absolutely essential. Yes, it has challenges like any new program, but those skill sets of understanding populations are absolutely necessary for Somalia, Yemen, Chad, around the world. But now that's been disestablished. All these little adaptations, even like the A-10, which is a crucial weapon of small wars, doesn't have a huge constituency. Thankfully, it keeps getting defended. There are always efforts to get rid of it. So these are just we are just not well designed to do these kinds of conflicts. And usually we figure them out towards the end, but then by that point it's it's been too long. So essentially the book is an effort to sort of capture some lessons that were learned at a brief period of time, try to talk about that these lessons aren't just specific to Afghanistan, they can be as readily applied in a tailored fashion to other conflicts like Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and other conflicts. And then try to make sure we don't misremember this conflict. So to that end, don't limit yourself to one purchase. Feel free to buy multiple copies. I mean, your country needs you to do that. If you're an old friend you want to reconnect with, it might be a way to do that. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight and look forward to answering any questions you have. Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about, from your perspective and your experience there in Afghanistan, how the Iran and Hezbollah decades-long alliance with and support for the Taliban affected your mission there.
Well, I mean, the Taliban also killed a lot of Iranian diplomats too, so it's an unusual alliance if that's what you're saying. I didn't really see much Iranian activity. I was mostly worried about Pakistani activity in my province. In some of the Shia areas, Hazaran areas in Afghanistan, it was clear that the Iranian government had been reaching out to those communities. Later in the conflict, I would say, then I was in one mosque, for example, in a Hazaran area that had a lot of Iranian posters and propaganda in it. So it's an aspect of it, but it wasn't so much a factor where I was. It was mostly straight just Sunni insurgency versus Pashtun elders and Pakistani officers showing up and causing problems.
Your book may not be the stuff of American Sniper, but it sounds like it could make an interesting documentary. Have you thought about that?
I accept your offer. Oh, no, sorry. Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. It would be great, but I wonder what cinematically how we could convey it. I think it would be great.
The French in Algeria and the British had a similar organization. They were colonial officers. They weren't
Right.
State Department. They weren't military.
Right.
The Marines only started their local action program out of necessity. State doesn't want to do it.
Right.
Is it time for the United States to organize a different institution to handle this stabilization and nation building and other things that neither one really wants to do?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I've written a lot of articles up to that end. You have to, in assessing like the bureaucratic politics of it, you've got to hitch it to something that will survive. And I think I'm kind of inclined to think there may be a political service attached to SOCOM, for instance, that might be able to do that. The State Department actually has a reserve Army unit that's attached to it. That might be a possible place to use, But again, I think it goes back to there's very rarely a constituency that supports these kind of things. Because by the time we get to the point where we actually have some wisdom about it, people say, oh, we're not going to do those irregular war things again. They're too expensive, too hard, kind of the Vietnam syndrome. But I completely agree with you. We've got to adjust. We've lost as an American republic the ability to move beyond the limits of our bureaucracy and adapt. We've moved from being a frontier nation to this bureaucratic nation in many ways that have prevented our ability to adapt to these conflicts. And I absolutely agree with you.
Thank you very much. I loved everything you said. I loved every lesson learned, etc. What leaped out at me is, your comment about a colonial approach, which is not our mandate, not our history to be colonialists. And there's nothing about what you were describing that was a defense of the homeland. It was colonialism. Why are we there?
Well, I wouldn't say it's colonialism. Our country was born out of an insurgency, right? I think it's a truly American approach to doing this. It's an empowerment approach. It's a humbler approach. I'm a big fan of making sure that we don't have attacks come from Afghanistan again. And I think there's a unique American way of doing that. There are people within the military and State Department who like to do this, who know how to do it, but their careers are not incentivized to do it. I was fortunate. I did a State Department tour and a military tour, and that's simply by accident. It was by no means a designed kind of effect. But I think there are people who are willing to do it, but they need this bureaucratic off-ramp to get out of this need to constantly move up or constantly rotate. And the Afghan Hands program was an attempt to do that. And I think it's absolutely a correct idea. But like a lot of these, ideas for Afghanistan and adapted to these conflicts. They had a lot of bureaucratic opponents, and there were some challenges with it. But to me, that's just an invitation to keep perfecting it. But yeah.
I am not criticizing the approach. I think
Yeah.
the approach was absolutely wonderful and perfect. I'm questioning the mission.
Sure. I think we had adopted an approach that I think you're advocating when we pulled out of Afghanistan the first time, after the Soviet Union had withdrawn and eventually, the communist government had fallen in 1992. So I think there was a little bit of lessons learned from that, saying we need to have some persistent engagement or persistent presence. But I think how we went about it creates the antibodies for the actual way of doing it. Once you finally figure it out, you've actually burned through these other approaches, which burned all the goodwill and support for the conflict. But anyway, I agree. We'll talk later for sure.
Yeah, I have the mic now.
Yes, sir.
Have you read the recent book by Max Boot?
About Edward Lansdale?
And if so, what you've written sounds like your philosophy is basically the same.
I've read Lansdale's memoir, In the Midst of Wars. I have started reading Max Boot's book about it. And I agree, he's another example. He's a bureaucratic outlier. Came out of the OSS, joined the agency, became an Air Force officer, and he was always on the bureaucratic margins, and he cut his teeth with Magsaysay in the Philippines. But he never got the traction that he could because of Westmoreland.
You overcame him too.
Right, exactly. And I think you've got to design it in such a way that it is able to survive political change and political people getting elected or not elected, and recognize it as bureaucratic peer competitors. There's a way of doing it, I think, but we're at that point now in the conflict where we're just getting rid of all these institutional adaptations. Human training systems been done away with. All these different things like that are being done away with. It's almost like when they created SOCOM, right? Special operations are always kind of this marginalized by the conventional forces, and eventually they decided to institutionalize it in a big push. I think that's what you're going to need, but
I have another question, if I might. Afghanistan is a country that can't really afford itself.
right.
The amount of money it can raise is not as much money as it needs to spend. Now, you said the program was working because the Afghan government was paying the soldiers, was paying the police that we were training. But, those funds came from the United States or from the
Sure.
international community in the first place.
Right.
And it has to be, the only way it can be sustained is with outside support. And Afghan history has always been that.
Right, exactly. Of course, I think you need a light, lean, and long-term approach there. I think a lot of these sort of ugly American tendencies of how we wage these conflicts started to arrive really large and in charge in 2009, 2010. As you may know too, they discovered quite a collection of minerals in Afghanistan, the Geological Service. Obviously, there are aspects of that make it hard to exploit, but there's a potential for them to be more self-sustaining. But I think you have to be there in a way that's light, lean, and long-term. Like when I was there in 2005, and we didn't know we were the poor war, that forced us to be more humble in our approach, made us to rely on indigenous structures and leaders much more readily. And I think that's the right way to do it. I think you can do this, but you've got to be willing to take more risk. You've got to organize yourself that more dispersed manner. And there's a whole lot of sort of institutional things you have to do to make it work. But I think the big thing is dealing with the Pakistan problem. That's probably why we're all talking about it here in 2018, I think. Yeah.
When you talk about the Pakistan issue and the problems you had, were those from Pakistani Army or ISI?
I say around the book, Pakistani intelligence officers. Yeah. The thing we had the Afghan local police, once they got set up, they would see someone planting an IED. I talk about in the book how Afghan local police picked up a Pakistani intelligence officer. I talk about them very readily. There's no, it is what it is. That's why I draw attention to it.
So, thank you very much. Fascinating explanation. I really learned a lot from that. So, looking forward, 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, whatever. We're at war with Iran.
Okay.
Kinetic war. Serious war.
All right.
How would you suggest applying what you have learned over these many years to that type of a conflict or type of a war?
At the Institute, I write about Yemen a lot these days, so I'm more familiar with what Iran is doing in Yemen with the Houthis, et cetera. This approach can be adapted to a situation like that. I think this isn't a strategy that works better for Iranian proxy wars than it might be for big nation state wars. But I think the bottom-up approach absolutely works. It's very devastating. Like, if you look at Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, they've got a population-centric approach now. They're very much rhetorically, but also just through some of their actions, have local governing programs to try to get these hearts and minds. That's exactly what this is. This is not just a security program. It was a governing program. It was a tribal empowerment program. It was just essentially it's a people's war, to use a phrase from the Cold War. And I think that approach can be very devastating. But again, it's all about, it doesn't have to be U.S. necessarily. As long as the functions are being performed. It could be the UAE, for example, who are doing a lot of this in Yemen. But the concepts, I think, are sound. I mean, it's kind of, but it's just, you have to adapt them to each situation.
Like the others, I want to thank you for that very clear presentation. And to me, the very depressing lesson that we never learn the lessons.
Right.
Every time there's a next war, we go in. After we screwed it up, we learn better. By then, we're too tired of it. The next time around, it's the same thing all over again.
Right.
And the question is, why don't we learn?
Mm-hmm.
And you've given an answer, which was a very good answer on an institutional level. Our institutions screw it up.
Right.
But I'm not satisfied that that's the main part of the answer. I'm satisfied that that's a very useful part.
Right.
But it seems to me that we have to look also at ideological factors. Why are we allergic to learning? And this gentleman's comment that we don't want to be colonialists, I think, goes close to that. We don't learn from others who have had the business of nation building, pacification, throughout history, certainly, and very much in modern history, because our national mythology is to despise that and feel we're more superior to any such kind of thing. You said your approach is humble. His approach was humble. Everyone's out to prove they're more humble. All the last 4 presidents have come in promising to be more humble. I want us to promise to get it right, not to be either arrogant or humble, but to try to get it right, which generally we don't do until it's too late. I'm wondering, would you add some ideological factors to your explanation, and how can we deal with them? Because I don't think the institutional ones, important as they are, will solve it.
No, I talked a lot also about how we misremember these conflicts, how we chronicle them or mischronicle them in books and movies. This, for example, like in think tanks. I work at a think tank that's focused on the Middle East, has very strong views on certain issues. It's funded by U.S. citizens, but I write on Yemen. And I'm kind of the redheaded stepchild there. They support me completely, but it's not a career-enhancing move to focus on a country like Yemen. It is these days because of Al-Qaeda, but where is the institution that has the Chad expert or the Mali expert or these kind of places? So we have a bias not just in our government, but also in our institutions that inform the government as much as echo some of its views and challenge them on big nation states. I could have a heck of a great career if I focused on China. It'd be great, right? If I was a Russia expert, I'd probably do okay still, But where's the institution that has all these small states? There are a lot of what I call academic nomads. There are people in the world who have a great passion for Somalia, Yemen, these kinds of countries. But because of how our academic institutions have changed and become much more focused on rigor and statistical analysis and things of this nature, these are experts who are often homeless. There's a scholar who I think very highly of named Stephen Day, who's written voluminously about Yemen. He's an adjunct professor at Rollins College, and his dissertation was published by Cambridge on Yemen. It's actually a fabulous work. But he's at Rollins College as an adjunct, and I love Stephen Day. But he's not so unique. And so I wish there was a think tank that had all these small nation states, of scholars to give them a home to inform policy. Because how do you fund a think tank? Like academia, because of the methodological revolution, is much more rigorous, but they're less relevant. And think tanks are more relevant, but they're less rigorous. And so there's got to be some balancing point there. But again, who's going to fund a Somalia expert and a Chad expert? And who was an Afghan expert before 9/11? There are a few. But everyone kind of saw them as, well, that's interesting. That's not a career, my young man. You need to do something different. So.
Michael?
Thank you very much for a stimulating talk. A couple of questions.
Yeah.
What's happened to Uzurgan since you left, number one? And number two, do the regional powers, Egypt, for example, or the UAE you mentioned, do they, in fighting the wars in Yemen or the Sinai or the Western Desert, have they imbibed any of the wisdom that they learn when they come here to the United States for training? Are some of these techniques incorporated in the Egyptian army or SOF? Is there an Egyptian SOF? Thank you very much.
I don't think the Egyptians were in Afghanistan, but the UAE definitely were.
No, I mean in Sinai.
I'm not as familiar with that campaign. I strongly suspect they don't have much of a hearts and minds approach, but I know UAE has done multiple years in Afghanistan, and they've actually adopted a lot of these ideas and are using them in Yemen, to be honest with you. So that's very encouraging, I think. So.
And it was her guns.
So Uruzgan, we transitioned the province to Afghan control in 2012, and I would say in 2012, it was a wise decision. You know, most of the Taliban attacks were these individual level attacks. It was hard for them to scrape together 30 people to do some sort of operation, whereas 6 years previously, you get 250, 300 Taliban try to attack a forward operating base with the goal of overrunning it. As we drew down, and we tended to go more force protection conscious, the Taliban predictably used internal safe havens in some parts of the country we hadn't pacified, started to chip away at logistical support networks for the Afghan army. The Afghan army, for instance, they're not locals, so they often aren't particularly incentivized to protect local communities. But Afghan National Police and local police are. But you need all three of those institutions working together because they check and balance each other pretty effectively. And so the Taliban tried to retake Uruzgan. We predictably went back, to try to, they've plussed up to conventional size, so we're going to smash them back down to insurgency size. And that's kind of where we're at now. I'm not exactly as well versed on that now. I can tell you more about the ISIS campaign now because that's been my latest tour, but yeah.
My name is Akbar from the Afghan Embassy. I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Green, for the book and the talk. This is what we need, the Afghans actually. A better understanding of the Americans of Afghanistan. Real problems and books, even if they are boring, like as you say, those are the books that we need to
My book is absolutely riveting.
Because we at the same, similarly, we have a problem with us, the image of Afghanistan as a non-friendly, non-foreign friendly country, the graveyard of empires, all those myths that are, none of them are true. Afghans are not those savages that just would like to kill anybody that comes, and people like you who had close engagement with Afghans understand that more than anybody else. This helps us a lot. I was on the other side of course, the table back when you were in Afghanistan, and advisors and friends in the military, changing every 6 months, new faces. In the beginning, it was, happy to know more people, but when everything was restarted, reinvented, the wheels, what's happening here? Even we had ISAF lose all its computers and hard drives and all the data they had lost, so we had to. But as I said in the beginning, thank you for all the work you did. And hopefully more people read books like yours, and those snipers and Hollywood stuff that they are just they are hurting us, and they are hurting the image of America in Afghanistan too. The Yankees with their guns, which Afghans. If my father was a mujahideen fighting the Soviets, we were refugees in Iran when the Soviets came in, and at home we were living in Iran. At home, my father, he's not illiterate, but a few names he knew still. He remembers President Reagan because he was our friend. He gave him guns and money, and he fought the Soviets. most of the Afghans, as you know, are traditional Muslims. They don't really know Arabic. They don't. It's difficult to radicalize them because of those fundamental differences.
Right.
And hopefully, and still that's a big potential for stabilize Afghanistan, the population that we have. And the more we know about those people, not about ISIS trained or Al Qaeda affiliated groups that are very, very small
Right.
minority. And the Taliban, you know,
Yeah.
they're different. The better that the U.S. policies and the American public opinion can help us in this, conclude this war.
Right. Well, that's one of the things I tried to do in the book was try to talk about the Afghans in a way that didn't make them targets, they weren't intelligence sources, they weren't shooting at you, to really humanize the Afghans in the Uruzgan province, to show the histories, show the background, show the stories, make the reader understand and sympathize with their challenges, show that there is great variability in the Afghan community. There are heroes, there are victims, there are bad people that have nothing to do with the Taliban. And just show the complexity of the reality of these tours. Because I'd have my tour and I'd come back and the way the war was talked about at home was very different from the way I'd experienced it, which prompted me to wonder why that was the case, and then led on to other things.
The last sentence was that the thing I liked was one American senior official in Kabul said, why are you helping us? He said, we like the underdogs. We like to help you because we know your southern neighbor is pushing your hand in a way that it's not fair.
Great.
So thank you. I mean, as putting aside being a government official, as an Afghan, I got my education and the government we have over there and the good economy we have. I mean, these are the stuff that people don't talk about.
Yeah.
Afghanistan is way richer and well off now.
Well, I'll put you down for 100 copies then to give to the Afghan leaders. I appreciate it. That's very kind, sir. You see it. We're all witnesses. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Enjoyed it a great deal. Could you give us a quick, you mentioned SEAL teams, and you mentioned Green Beret.
Right.
Could you give us a quick, what you did actually just going out with a group?
Sure,
Going
sure.
to a village and scheduling?
Yeah, sure. So when we decided to establish a village stability platform is what we would call it. Essentially thinking of it as a place that you could have a civil affairs element, psychological element, a women's outreach element. You'd have civil affairs teams, and then you'd have the core of it would be a SEAL element or a Green Beret element. We would do a clearing operation first. So we would do all the homework we could about a district and try to understand who are the tribal leaders, what are the tribes, had we been there before in some fashion, had we had a base there that we closed, what have you. We would go in, clear it of the Taliban with Afghan commandos partnered with Green Berets or SEALs. Clear out the villages there, so there'd be kinetic activity. So at that point, 100% of our activity is kinetic, violence done to the enemy. Once we did that, we would have immediate meetings with the elders, principally with the village elders, but we try to bring Afghan officials. And we say, look, we're not leaving. We're gonna create a base. We'd like to rent one of your compounds to do this. Okay, great. And we have this program called Village Stability Operations. We want to work with your tribal, your village elders, and you help us figure out what young men you think are deserving to defend your village. One of our themes was from the village, from their perspective. And then we start to have this, there's a little bit of building trust, right? So we would have these meetings, we would now build the base, or we'd move into a compound, reinforce it, and we would do a foot patrols. We would start to meet with the tribal elders at weekly, for lack of a better phrase, village council meetings. And then as they got to know us, as they became aware of the program, they started to recommend their young men to us. And then we would vet them, the Afghan National Police would vet them, the Ministry of Interior would vet them, and we would start training these young men in their home village. So it might be 10 people initially, 20 people, but then as you start to train them, they get their uniform, they get their weapon, they get their first paychecks, they've gotten like 3 or 4 weeks of training, and then we'd help them build their first three checkpoints. And we would be there as brothers, right? So the activity went from 100% kinetic to fairly quickly, once you start getting locals involved, 10% kinetic on your side. You know, is that tipping point. And then you get, essentially you would have a number of about 300 per district. That was our goal, you know. And so once we kind of got to that point, and some villages only needed 150, so that would be fine. And then once you did that, you had all the main roads checkpoints. A guy could have a bazaar shop, and then in the evening he'd do his checkpoint. You know, you'd have these rotations. And then, let's say you have 300, they'd have an Afghan local police commander, and then he would answer to the Afghan national police who were full-time. So the Afghan government controlled the Afghan local police, pay, logistics, ammunition, you name it. And once we did that, we started to transition the site to Afghan control. So maybe we'd bring in an Afghan commando unit to live in that village, to continue that partnership. And then we would visit over the course of the months. And a lot of what we would do is also make sure the logistical pieces worked, that the pay got delivered, the ammunition. And a lot of what we did was sort of honest broker stuff. We would work with the Afghan army to make sure, no, he wasn't insulting you, General, at the last meeting, the tribal, you know, just kind of stuff to kind of even out people's personalities and challenges. And that's kind of how we did it. And it was very effective. Because now the Taliban couldn't effectively intimidate the villagers because now they're organized and they have guns and they're supported. It's their brothers and their cousins, you know, all organized. They couldn't bribe the local officials that well because, you know, we knew that a portion of these salaries would go into the pockets of the elders as well. And then once you had security, the bazaar shops started to open up more business started to flow, prices started to go down. And then essentially you had this kind of virtuous sort of cycle that started to set in. And so it was very effective, and we just kept expanding that out.
Would you do it again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I loved it. I wish I was a few years, I mean, I'd love to go back, you know, frankly, but I've done enough of these tours. I only go back with friends at this stage. I'm just tired. Because the other thing too is like, you know, you on an individual level, you feel like you're learning all the time, but I go back to the problem of these institutions, you know. And you kind of go back there and they look at you like you're saying things that were common knowledge, you know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, and they look at you like, you're crazy, you know. It's just, that's what gets wearying about it, to be honest with you. It's just like, my last tour in Iraq was 15, 16, and things I was talking about when it came to tribes in Anbar province, which I had been working in 07, because I think the Army was in charge, and the Army, while it had forces in Anbar, and some of their units did that, in general, the Army as an institution wasn't as involved in the Anbar Awakening. And so there, this basic common knowledge of the tribes was just really bad. You know, the willingness to take risk wasn't there. You know, it was just very, so I was writing all these papers that were just common knowledge when I was there, you know, 8 years previously, but now we're like, you know, revelations by 2015. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, has the cultivation of opium poppies ever presented a difficulty to our mission in Afghanistan?
Well, we, as a rule, would not go after poppy farmers because, frankly, the poppy fields surrounded our bases. And if we did that, I mean, guaranteed it would be, but we would go after, not we, there are certain forces within the general effort who would go after the heroin dealers and people like that, the smugglers. That's kind of how we would do it. There was also some attempts to have agricultural substitution, but it was never that, I wouldn't see very serious program. And yes, there was a lot of money spent on it, a lot of people doing good things, lots of patriotic Americans, but I don't think it was as serious an effort as it could have been. And sometimes these poppy fields were in areas that were controlled by the Taliban. So to do the anti-poppy, we really had to do a whole military effort to like pacify the area and clear it and then hold it. And, you know, we only had so much, you know, I mean, resources and priorities would challenge that. Yes, sir.
What you happened to say just now is very upsetting to me because if I understood you correctly, when you were there in 15, 16.
In Iraq, yeah.
In Iraq and in Anbar, Fallujah.
Right.
You were with the big army, I take it.
Right, right.
All right, so by that time, do I understand you to say that they had forgotten about tribes?
No, I think everyone said, hey, yeah, these tribes are really important, but...
Had they not read the Marines' history,
well, this goes back to,
those
yeah.
documents that are available to
Well, I
them
mean,
online?
everyone knew about the Anbar Awakening.
I mean, these were in detail interviews with the sheikhs that
Oh, it was a very common question when I first got there. Where are all the files on these things?
online.
Right, but yes. So because I was with the Navy, essentially I was in the wrong tribe, in the military tribe. I was in the Navy tribe. right. And I'm a reserve Navy tribe, so that's even less, you know, like, you know, and yeah, exactly. You know, then I had this PhD, and they're like, "What the heck's that?" And you know, so that was kind of So that was like working against me. And then I'm an 04, so these are colonels who are doing by, with, and through. They don't have units to lead, so it's all this energy's inside the wire, not outside the wire. So it got tended to focus on us junior officers, which we loved. So I said, hey, there was this Marine Corps thing called the EPIC cell, Economic Political Intelligence Cell. It focused on the human terrain of Anbar Province. And they hung all of their products on a website before they closed it down in 2010, I think. None of them knew about this. So I brought it to their attention, But then we had a tribal engagement cell at the embassy, which would do tribal engagement in Anbar and across the country. They were all military people, but wearing civilian clothes. But they couldn't really leave the green zone. So the tribal leader had to come to us. So the embassy had some tribal stuff going on. So they had tribal reports from 2011 when we drew down in Iraq till today. The military side, we didn't really have the records, but we kind of pockets here and there. And then we were doing key leader engagements with Anbar and other tribal leaders when I was there in 15, 16. So you had to kind of recreate. So what I was doing was a one-man fusion cell. So like 2 days or 3 days a week, I'd wear civilian clothes and go to the embassy, work there, do engagements, I met with a lot of the old Fallujah leaders I had worked with before. The mayor of Fallujah I knew, and he's like, "Oh my God, you've gained weight." He says, "But I look the same." And I was like, "Thanks, Mayor, I appreciate that." Yes, it's true. These are freedom pounds, as I call them. And so I would take those reports, and then I would go to the Marine website. Then I would dust off the Marine reports that had come out. Then I would look at other Marine works that had come out, articles, and I would put this all together in one series of documents. So we were looking at the town of Heat, for example, in Anbar Province, the Abu Nimr tribe. So I recreated the whole history of the U.S. experience in that city for our leaders to understand, what we were doing. Who were we engaging with today? Who did we used to engage with? We were actually engaging a different side of a tribal family, but no one knew that. But I pointed that out, so that was useful. But that's just, again, I think because I was this academic, I've been a Bush Cheney guy, I was in the Navy, I was a reservist, I was a think tank guy, I had a sensitivity to these things. But, it's kind of unusual,
I have many other questions, but thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much for your talk. A quick question regarding human terrain mapping. What, in your opinion, do you think it's going to take to get it revived? Because
right.
I sense from what you're saying that it is very important to give, with all our rotations coming in,
right.
to give something there for the incoming guy to read the history of what's there.
I think if you associate it with special operations, that has enough cachet in this town and in politics, and they have a great incentive to understand and know that, because they tend to be in these more austere locations. That might be a way of doing it. So if you gave me like the rounding error of the Department of Defense budget and just gave me that money, give me whatever that number is, like 4 decimal points after, that'd be enough resources, to do it, But you also need to be able to inform the DC policymaking process. So, because I'm at a think tank, I can testify on Capitol Hill, I meet with journalists, we do roundtables at the Institute, so I have some influence. So when I write about Al-Qaeda, or Yemen, for example, I always put Al-Qaeda in the title, because no one would read anything about Yemen, right? I'd be like, Al-Qaeda in midwives, like, oh, what's this Al-Qaeda thing? It's like, no one's gonna read it, So essentially, you've gotta be like, you gotta scare people to draw the attention.
Right.
And so that's replicated across, the only reason we know about Yemen and Somalia is because of Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda, in the Arabian Peninsula. So I think you need to create that think tank for these academic nomads that kind of maybe associate with the university, so that they have that time to kind of walk the halls of Congress and testify, and then be available for like NDU and the intelligence community and stuff like that. But,
Go to Georgetown or something?
or GW or whatever, AU. I like GW mostly because they can walk more readily to places, but I'm not a wedded to any one institution. But, I did get my PhD there, but whatever, Yeah.
If I could ask you, what did the people in Uruzgan province think you were doing there? How did they answer? What are the Americans doing?
They're like, why are you here? We hate it here.
Yeah, why? Get us out of here.
Sure, yeah.
No, and did you see the answer to that question change over your multiple tours?
Sure,
How
sure.
they answered, what are you doing
Sure.
here? That's question one. I'll give you, okay, answer that.
Yeah, you know, the Afghans I worked with in 05, when security was relatively good, we hadn't had a suicide vest attack or car bomb attack yet. The first one was in Kandahar in 05, but my whole tour in 05 in Uruzgan, I went on all sorts of foot patrols as a State Department person. I had meetings all the time downtown. They absolutely loved us there. They welcomed us there. They remember the Mujahideen period, and we supported them. They remember that we had helped bring Karzai back to power, because many of the tribal leaders from this province were from his tribe, or from his tribal confederation. So they very much welcomed us. You know, but there were other tribes that, you know, may or may not have been with the Taliban, but because we empowered some over the others, that started to create some ill will. So some of those tribes weren't huge fans of us, but they were open to us. But I think this warlord strategy we initially adopted, where we kind of partnered with them, many of these warlords were very zero-sum in how they looked at things. If you were against the government for any reason, which may be poor governance, you've been picked on by the government, you were Taliban. And we didn't have the active curiosity that we would eventually develop about understanding this kind of local stuff. And this is partly why I was there as a State Department guy, was to sort of figure out this, you know, all these complexities and try to bring some nuance. I interviewed a Special Forces soldier once in 05. I said, what tribes are these Taliban prisoners you're bringing in? He says, I don't care, I don't know, and I don't care. All I know is there's a reason I was at your house last night, you know, hitting it for some reason. I was like, that's exactly the wrong approach. You know, we're being played, and you don't even know it. But because it helps us through our career incentives and other reasons, we tend not to be sometimes as curious. You know, so there's probably been like 45 units that have rotated through Uruzgan since 9/11. You know, multiple nationalities too. You know, so.
And just one last question: what was the impact of the media that you could observe there? There was a big effort on our part to help the Afghans create an Afghan national radio.
Right.
There was a big effort right away to create 24/7 Pashto Dari, Voice of America, Radio Free, Liberty Broadcasting, which we did. Was there a discernible media impact where you were operating?
You know, when we first arrived in Uruzgan, there was no radio, there were no paved roads, there was no cell phone coverage, which I thought was great, by the way. So if the embassy wanted to get in touch with me, it's, I didn't get your email. I had email, but you can't call me. It was great. It was wonderful. But later in the war, we had universal cell phone coverage. Every Afghan who had any money had an iPhone, which is interesting. A lot of Afghans had solar-powered chargers on their Adobe huts to recharge their phones. Right? So, for example, when there would be an incident at Bagram, a Quran was burned accidentally or something of that nature, we would immediately feel the ripple effect later in the war. Whereas before, we were kind of isolated. You know, so that was, you know, a positive and a negative thing, right? So progress, they erected the last cell phone tower when I was there in 2012, and once that happened, the whole province was open to cell phone coverage. We had a paved road that took a 13-hour drive and made it a 3-hour drive that connected the province to Kandahar city, which is huge progress. But everyone could also check the internet now on their phones. So yeah, it started to impact things, but the Taliban would threaten people, you know, don't watch bad movies on your phones, we know what you're watching. They would sometimes threaten the cell phone towers, turn them off, but the Afghans are similar to us. They like their iPhones, they like their phones. So they would yell at the Taliban for turning off the tower for their phones. You know, it was a mixed bag. It was a good thing, helped us get our message out certainly more readily, and also gave the Afghan government greater ability to get their message out, which was very effective. So, you know, like anything, any technology, there may be positives and sometimes some downsides. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.